Hi, we come now to our final lecture in the book of Acts, in which we are going to finish up Paul's third mission tour and get him back to Jerusalem and ultimately get him to the city of Rome, the very center of the empire, at least politically speaking. As we do that, we need to get him back from the area of Asia and Greece and get him headed toward Jerusalem. So in Acts chapter 20, from Ephesus, Paul is going to cross the Aegean and he's going to go through Macedonia and then southward to Achaia. Now, presumably in Macedonia, he's going to visit the Thessalonians, the Philippians probably, the Bereans, then southward to Achaia, where he is probably going to go to Corinth. We can reasonably assume that he reached Corinth. What Luke says in Acts is that he went to Achaia, but Corinth would be the primary city in Achaia, and of course there is the church there. So we generally assume he probably wrote the letter to the Romans during this visit to Corinth, the 3 months he was in Greece. Luke says he was 3 months there. And usually scholars are going to assign the Roman letter to that period of his life. In this letter, he mentioned Phoebe of Cenchrea, which is the port city of Corinth. He also mentions Gaius and Erastus. Cenchrea, of course, is where he originally took his Nazirite vow. Erastus is the director of public works in Corinth, and we saw an inscription with his name in it in our previous lecture. But all of these would be members of the Corinthian church. Now, I should say a word about a collection of funds. When you come to the end of the Roman letter, you're going to see that Paul is making a collection of funds from various churches in the area of Greece and Asia, and he's going to be taking those funds back to Jerusalem. Earlier in the book, we noted, of course, in the earlier part of Paul's career, he and Barnabas had taken funds from Antioch to Jerusalem, a relief mission of sorts. Paul apparently took that as a lead for him to continue to do that sort of thing. And so he is making a collection of funds, and he's going to bring them to Jerusalem when he goes. As he mentions in the Roman letter, he now nearly has this collection complete. In fact, in the second Corinthian letter, there's going to be 2 chapters that are given to this collection of funds. And in fact, it is the longest sustained section in the New Testament about stewardship and about giving. So in any case, Paul is collecting funds from various churches, and representatives from these churches will be traveling with Paul to bring this money to the believers in Jerusalem. And this gift from the Greeks to the Jews in Jerusalem, I think in Paul's mind, would be a very strong reason to support the unity of the church. Paul is very concerned, I think, that the church does not divide along Jewish and Gentile lines, but that there is one church. In fact, his Ephesian letter is one of the strongest statements about the unity of the church. In any case, Paul is going to retrace his steps. His 3 months in Corinth ends with actually one more plot against him by Jews from the synagogue who are very antagonistic to his message about Jesus. Now, Paul had intended to head for Jerusalem by ship, but he's going to change his plans kind of at the last. Now, I'm guessing that because many Jews are going to be headed to Jerusalem for the Festival of Pentecost, and in fact, Paul wants to get there himself by the Festival of Pentecost, but my guess is that being confined on a boat with a bunch of Jews who really don't like him, and some of them which would be, their dislike would be strong enough to maybe even erupt into violence, that wasn't a very attractive prospect. So rather than getting on a boat at this point, he is going to actually take a different route. He's going to return to the mainland of Asia by way of Macedonia. So he's coming back through Macedonia again. And ahead of him, he's going to send representatives from the churches in Berea, Thessalonica, Derbe, and Lystra, as well as some from Asia. And all of them are going to wait for him at Troas. Now, likely, these are probably the representatives that he actually mentions in 2 Corinthians 8. There, he doesn't give as many details, but he does mention that there are representatives of the church that are going to go with him and to carry this gift. And he wants to do everything openly and above board. He wants to be sure that there's no question about the handling of these funds. Would that modern Christians would take the same care in the way that they handle funds with respect to the churches. So Paul is headed back northward toward Macedonia and then eventually across the Aegean again toward Asia. From Philippi, once he gets to Philippi, that's of course where he's going to be near the seacoast and once more will cross the northern tip of the Aegean. This is where Luke is going to pick up with the first person plural pronouns again, the we sections. So it appears that Luke has been in Philippi for some time and that he is going to join Paul as Paul sails eastward across the Aegean, joining the company at Troas, where he's going to stay for a week. Now, at Troas, Paul is speaking to a group of Christians there late into the night. One of the English translations I find a little humorous in its translation, but in fact fair to the Greek text. It just says, as Paul talked on, and I would suppose that most all of us who are listening have at one time or another been in a church service where the pastor went on and on. Well, Paul is going on, and as it turns out, there was a young man who was sitting in the window of an upper story window, apparently fell out the window and died in the fall. Paul is going to go down and pray for him, and the young man is going to be raised from the dead. A couple of things about this meeting at night. First of all, it is on the first day of the week, but it is an evening service. Now, you do need to remember that in the Roman world, there's not a weekend, so Sunday's a normal work day. So probably this service is held at night because most of the people who would attend the service were working on that particular day. The other thing that I think is interesting is that because it's at night, it says that there were many lamps in the room. Now, little clay terracotta lamps, some of them with only a single wick, some with a couple of wicks. We've seen some with 4 wicks that have been excavated, but these would be small candle, almost like small candles. They're not candles, but they're basically clay lamps, which are they have a little layer of water in them, and then there is olive oil, and then there is a wick that extends down into the olive oil. The water seals the porous clay, and then the wick would soak up the oil, and lighting that would give a light for the evening. You can actually make those lamps a little brighter by sprinkling salt on them. That makes them burn brighter. But in any case, this was the sort of thing that is happening. So the boy had fallen out the window. Paul quickly went down. He hugged the boy, and the boy revived, and everything ended well. The language that's used here, as I mentioned, was on the first day of the week, and this is the first occasion of describing a Christian worship service on Sunday. Typically, Paul has attended synagogue services, and of course, those are all on the 7th day of the week, which would be Saturday. Sunday, though, was the day that Christ rose from the dead. It was the first day of the week. So it's certainly understandable that Christians might choose that for the day of worship. By the time you get into the post-apostolic fathers of the church, and this is not very far down the line, this will be in the very early 100s, already it seems to have become the standard holy day for Christians. So even though it was a work day, still it was the day that Jesus rose from the dead. So usually services for Christians in this early period are going to be early in the morning before daylight, before they had to go to work, or after sundown, since Sunday was this regular workday. The other thing of interest here is that there is this expression, breaking bread. I had occasion to talk about that way back in, I think, the second lecture, where this term is used in the Jerusalem church in Acts chapter 2. At this early period, it seems, and most scholars would agree with this, it seems that the breaking of bread is a way of talking about the Eucharist, but that it probably also included a full meal, not just the sort of symbolic side of the meal that replicates what Jesus did at the Last Supper. As Paul is on this trip back to Jerusalem, this is going to be punctuated with a number of messages by prophets that when he arrived, he would face bondage. You're going to find this on more than one occasion in the book of Acts. And this raises a couple of interesting issues. First of all, in spite of these warnings, Paul was determined to go to Jerusalem. He doesn't take these warnings as forbidding him to go to Jerusalem. Rather, what he says is he felt compelled by the Spirit to go to Jerusalem. So the warnings, even though they say that when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to face some difficulty there, nonetheless, he doesn't take those as a restriction against himself. He doesn't know exactly what's going to happen in Jerusalem. These warnings, however, seem to anticipate that he is going to be imprisoned and that he will face hardship, possibly even death. In one of these occasions, the prophet Agabus, we met him earlier because he's the one that predicted the severe famine in the days of Claudius. Agabus actually ties Paul up as a symbol that when he gets to Jerusalem, this is what's going to happen to him. But Paul doesn't seem to construe these messages as forbidding his trip, but rather as informative messages about what he is to expect. And furthermore, we know that he is under vows. So the completion of this vow must happen at Jerusalem. Possibly Paul had stipulated that Pentecost, the festival of Pentecost, would be the completion of his vow. So he wants to make it to Jerusalem, and he is intent on doing that. Paul is not going to break his vow to God. He takes very seriously the idea that you find in the Old Testament that it's better not to vow a vow at all, rather than to vow a vow and to break it. So in the end, it was Paul's own sense of the Spirit's direction, not somebody else's warning, that was determinative. And that is something I think for modern Christians to consider seriously as well. They need to come in whatever they think God wants them to do. They need to come to their own decision about this and their own understanding what they think that the Spirit is saying to them, rather than take this secondhand from someone else. From Miletus, they hit on several islands. Now they're in commercial vessels, changing vessel on one occasion, which is unusual, because when you're traveling in a commercial vessel, you pretty much have to go where they're going. And they may not be going directly where you want to go, but at least you're going to get partway there and maybe have to change to another kind of vessel. So that is kind of what's happening there. They stayed a week at Tyre, which is in Phoenicia. And once again, Paul is warned about what's going to happen when he gets to Jerusalem. Eventually, they reach the port of Caesarea. This is the port which has an artificial harbor that was built by Herod the Great. This is the area, of course, where Peter had once visited the house of a Roman centurion. Paul has been in Caesarea before as well. And they're going to stay with one of the seven, Philip. Now, this is the first place you have this title or this language, the seven. Way back earlier in the earlier part of the book of Acts, when the apostles appointed the seven, they listed seven by name, but they didn't have the title, the seven, at least listed there. Here we have a formal title of the seven, which is a little bit like the title for the apostles, which is the 12. So in any case, Paul is going to stay with Philip while he is in Caesarea. And once more, he's warned about Jerusalem. But he is determined to go, and the brothers are going to escort him southward to the city of Jerusalem. So that brings us now to the end of his third mission tour. He is in Jerusalem. He's going to report to the church. And now we're turned to the things that are going to happen in the city itself. Upon his arrival, Paul immediately faces a rather delicate situation, a tricky situation, which is going to take some finesse to avoid problems. He reports on his mission work, but he is informed that a reputation has preceded him. Now, this reputation may not have been entirely fair because it was, in fact, a distortion. But the rumor, at least, was that Paul was urging diaspora Jews to abandon the Torah. Now, we don't know whether they got this idea from things that he said in some of his letters or things that were said by verbal reports that had been somehow transported to Jerusalem by traveling Jews. In fact, it wasn't true. Paul was not telling Torah observant Jews to abandon the Torah. He was insisting that the Gentiles who came to Christ did not have to become Jews in order to become Christians, and they didn't have to be Torah observant. And of course, he had carried the letter from the Jerusalem church that said this very thing. So this perception was a mistaken perception, but apparently it was a widely believed perception. So since all of the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem apparently were Torah observant, it was decided that to dispel this rumor, Paul should accompany some of the brothers to the temple. Now, Paul is under vow, as we've said before. He has taken a Nazirite vow, and he intends to complete that at the temple. Now, there are some other brothers who also have taken what appears to be Nazirite vows, and so the advice given to Paul is that he should go with them. That way, when he completes his vow, there will be verbal testimony of others who were with him at the time he completes his vow, and he will accompany them when they are completing their vows. The ritual in the temple involved not only shaving your head once again and offering the hair, but also offering 4 offerings. These are described in some detail in Numbers chapter 6. So we would assume that when he goes to the temple, Paul is going to offer these 4 offerings along with the others that are with him as a Torah observant Jew. Hopefully, this would diffuse the unfortunate rumors that had arisen about him. Well, when he entered the temple precincts, this, of course, is itself an action that requires purification. Paul had been traveling among Gentiles, and it was the general opinion that all Gentile countries were unclean, and therefore Paul needed to go through ritual purification. Luke does not describe what that involves, but at least from what we know about Jewish purification, and especially some of the ideas that we have from the Talmud and the Mishnah, it seems not unlikely that Paul would have undergone a ritual baptism in a mikveh. Luke doesn't say that, but at least that would have been fairly common. In any case, Paul would not have been able to go beyond the court of the Gentiles, or what is sometimes called the court of the nations, if he had not done the required purification. So that would have prevented him from going into the court of Israel. He would have had to undergone purification to get into the court of Israel. Now, there were in Jerusalem, because they had come to celebrate the festival of Pentecost, there were some Asian Jews. We don't know for sure where they're from, but in all likelihood, they probably were from Ephesus. Paul had spent 3 years in Ephesus, so there were a lot of Jews in Ephesus who knew him. And they saw Paul there, and they seized him, charged him that he had not only opposed the Torah, but that he had brought a Greek beyond the barrier. Now, that wasn't true either, but earlier they had seen Paul in company with one of the Greek Christians whose name was Trophimus, and they assumed that he had brought a Greek into the court of Israel. Well, this is very unfortunate, but they are on the verge of lynching him. Paul is dragged from the temple, and had it not been for an alert Roman officer that saw this happening from the Antonia fortress, Paul may have been lynched on the spot, perhaps stoned to death. The Antonia fortress was located right at the northern part of the Temple Mount. And so it actually had a stairway that went from the Antonia fortress right down into the court of the nations. And a Roman officer saw the commotion and quickly descended with some soldiers, clapped Paul in irons, but in fact rescued him from being lynched. Around the court of Israel in the temple precincts, there were a number of what we would call in the modern world, I suppose, keep out signs. This is one of them that has been excavated by archaeologists. There were several, and they were sometimes written in Greek, sometimes written in Latin. This particular one is written in Greek. And if you look at this stone, you can see right here where my cursor is, you have the middle portion of the Greek word thanatos. This is the word here that you see over to the right. Now, the word thanatos is the Greek word for death. So this keep out sign basically says, don't cross this line or we'll kill you. And in fact, that's exactly what they were going to do to Paul. They were going to lynch him because they felt like he had crossed the barrier with a Greek. So this is part of this situation of Paul's arrest. Well, the Roman tribune entered the court of the nations with some soldiers and shackled Paul with chains. That, of course, diffuses the lynch mob, but there is so much hubbub going on, the officer wasn't even clear about what the issue was. Why are they rioting? So he brings Paul up the steps into the Antonia fortress, into the barracks. And as he's being carried inside, Paul speaks to the tribune in Greek. Well, that was a surprise because Paul obviously is Jewish, and this is a Jewish issue. Many, if perhaps maybe most of the typical Jew that lived in Jerusalem doesn't speak much Greek. Paul here is speaking apparently very fluent Greek, and so this was quite a surprise to the tribune. The tribune was aware of another rebel, and he actually an Egyptian rebel, and someone who was a messianic pretender, had caused some trouble apparently previously, and so he thought maybe this was who Paul was. Now he discovers this, in fact, is not who Paul is, and Paul requests that he be allowed to speak to the crowd, and he's going to do this on the basis of his Roman citizenship. So this is now the second time that Paul's Roman citizenship has become a very important feature. So the tribune gave him consent. If Paul is a Roman citizen, he wants to talk to this crowd, let him do so. This will be the first of 5 speeches that are made in the book of Acts in which Paul is going to defend himself. We call these Paul's 5 defenses, but they are all to different groups or to different persons. This one is to the Jews. And in this one, Paul is going to address the crowd in Aramaic from the steps of the Antonia fortress. Paul is obviously multilingual. He speaks Greek, he speaks Aramaic, he reads Hebrew, he possibly even knew Latin. We're not so sure about that. But in any case, he speaks to the Jews that are in the courtyard below, and he is standing on the steps so that he is elevated above them. And in this speech, he's going to recount his studies under the Rabbi Gamaliel. Well, pretty much everybody would have known who Gamaliel was. He was one of the most famous of the rabbis in this period of time. So Paul is going to talk about his earlier life when he came to Jerusalem to study as a disciple of Gamaliel. He's going to talk about his action as a persecutor of Christians. He worked for the Sanhedrin, arresting Christians. And then he's going to explain his conversion. He was on his way to Damascus to arrest Christians, to extradite them to Jerusalem. There he is struck down by a bright light, and he is commissioned by Christ to preach to the Gentiles. Well, everybody's listening, I'm sure, very closely, but when he talks about being commissioned to the nations by Christ Jesus, that is going to light the fire of trouble once again. So he certainly had addressed them in a way that grabbed their attention by speaking Aramaic. He talks about all the things that happened on the Damascus Road. But when he describes what happened to him in Jerusalem, he, interestingly enough, is going to say that he has a vision in the temple. Now, this would be the temple that they are just outside of. And in the temple, and by in the temple, I don't think he means in the holy place of the temple. Only a priest would be allowed to go in there. But within the temple precincts. And in the temple precincts, he was commissioned to preach to the Gentiles. And so the crowd now erupts once again and forces the tribune to bring him on into the barracks in the Antonia fortress. So once again, as in Philippi, his Roman citizenship has become a very important factor, and in this particular occasion probably saved him from corporal punishment. In Philippi, he actually was beaten. That was before the magistrates realized he was a citizen. But his citizenship is now going to loom large in all of the narratives throughout the rest of the book of Acts. In fact, it will be his citizenship that will get him headed toward Rome. So this term citizenship is polites, and it probably means that his name was on the roll of Roman citizens in Tarsus. So his citizenship could be proved, and if you should ever claim to be a Roman citizen and you really weren't, you were in serious trouble. So if, as he claimed, he was a citizen by birth, this is what Paul says. He says, I was born free. That in turn means that his father was a citizen before him. Now, we don't know how Paul's father became a citizen. Presumably, Paul's father was Jewish, and Jewish citizens were relatively rare. But there are various ways to become a citizen. For one thing, you could have done some kind of special service to the emperor. And maybe that would be the case in this case. We just simply aren't told. But it was illegal to punish a Roman citizen without a formal hearing. And so this, on this occasion, is going to save Paul from being beaten. Citizens also had the right to appeal directly to Caesar. Now, that's a big deal because in this particular case, eventually Paul is going to claim that right to appeal to Caesar. You need to understand, however, that a citizen that appealed to Caesar is going to have to wait for Caesar's pleasure. In this particular case, when Paul finally gets to Rome, he's going to wait a couple of years. And furthermore, prisons in the Roman system were not at all like modern prisons where you get free food and exercise and maybe get to watch TV or something. You had to support yourself when you were in prison. So Paul is going to need all of the help he can get if he's going to await a hearing before Caesar. We'll get to that issue a little bit later in the lecture. Now Paul is going to give his second defense, this time to the Sanhedrin. Paul has been mostly absent from Jerusalem for the last number of years. So the membership of the Sanhedrin has probably changed. Paul probably doesn't know very many of them at this point. He probably might have known a few of them, but undoubtedly a number of those that he had known earlier had now either passed or maybe had retired. We're not sure. And it's we don't have any reason to think that Paul himself had ever been a member of the Sanhedrin. I've heard that speculated on, but there's some substantial reason for thinking that's not the case. In any case, when he's speaking to the Sanhedrin, he's going to throw this whole body in confusion by claiming to be a Pharisee who believes in bodily resurrection. So Paul's accusers, of course, are Jewish, and the issue concerns Jewish law. So the tribune calls for an assembly of the Sanhedrin, which would be the 70 elders of Israel, and they would be presided over by the high priest, 70 plus 1. During the hearing, there is an insult and a backhanded blow that results in a retort by Paul. And it's in this retort that you get a little bit of a flavor of Paul's personality, apparently pretty quick on the draw, we might say. Paul says to this high priest, he says, but he doesn't actually know he's the high priest. He just knows he's a member there of the Sanhedrin. He says, God will smack you, you whitewashed wall. Well, that's a not only an epithet, that also is a recall of a passage in the book of Ezekiel, in which whitewash was used to whitewash leaders who were liars. So Paul gives a pretty stiff retort, and when they tell him that it was the high priest, then he apologizes for doing it because of the high priest's office. But in this context, he's going to give this sudden announcement that he is a Pharisee. Now, this is a very interesting statement because this is given in the present tense, and in Greek, it is an emphatic construction. For those of you who may know Greek, this is what is called an ego eimi construction. He doesn't say, I used to be a Pharisee or I once was a Pharisee. He says very emphatically, I am a Pharisee, which seemed to suggest that he believed that it was quite possible to be a Pharisee and still be a follower of Jesus. Well, because the Sanhedrin is composed of both Pharisees and Sadducees, and one of the points of difference between them, of course, has to do with resurrection. The Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. The Pharisees, of course, did. Paul says, I'm a Pharisee, and the whole issue here is that I believe in the resurrection. Well, that polarizes the members of the Sanhedrin, and so the Pharisee members are actually going to look more favorably upon Paul, while the Sadducees, of course, are very disturbed by him. In any case, there was so much turbulence that there was eventually a plot against Paul's life, and this was reported to the tribune, this officer. And so Paul has heard this through a family member. This is how we know he has a sister in Jerusalem and a nephew and so on. So he makes plans. The tribune's going to make plans. We've got to get Paul out of here. There's a serious attempt of assassination. So under heavily armed guard, which is composed of several hundred foot soldiers as well as a detachment of cavalry, Paul is going to be taken in the middle of the night to Caesarea, where he's going to be arraigned before Felix the governor. I don't know whether Paul was accustomed to riding horses or not, but on this particular occasion, he probably is going to ride a horse to Caesarea. The Tribune wrote a letter to the governor explaining the circumstances, how Paul had been arrested in this riot in the temple precincts. And so Paul is duly sent north, but kept under guard to await his accusers. Now, this move to the north accomplishes a couple of important things. First of all, Paul is a Roman citizen, so he's going to be kept safely, and the assassins are not going to be able to kill him. Reading this text, I've often wondered, these assassins said they would not eat or drink until they had killed Paul. I'm doubtful that they starved to death. They probably thought better of that statement later, but the fact remains they were not able to get to it. And this change in venue then puts the responsibility on the Sanhedrin to travel to Caesarea if they want to make a formal charge. And that's going to be, 2 or 3 days travel to get to Caesarea. So in Caesarea, Paul is going to give his third defense, this time at the seat of government, where he appears before Felix, the procurator. Now, we know the years that Felix was in office. So this is going to be, it has to be in the period sometime probably just prior to Felix being recalled, sometime probably in AD 58 or 59. In any case, Paul says he's come to Jerusalem to worship. He's come to give gifts to his people. And of course, the gifts to his people would be this relief offering that he had been collecting from the various churches in Greece and Asia. Well, it took the Sanhedrin 5 days to sort of get themselves together, make the trip to Caesarea, and present their case against Paul. And the charge was that Paul had incited riots worldwide and had desecrated the temple. Now, both of these are capital offenses from one way or another, but one from a Roman perspective and the other from a Jewish perspective. From a Roman perspective, Claudius already had driven out Jews from Rome. He had written a letter to at least Alexandria warning them about turbulent Jews. And of course, in Paul's various appearances in Asia and Greece, there was probably some flavor of that in the reactions against Paul. Now they're going to say this is a man who has been causing riots. So this is a problem because it disturbs the Pax Romana. It violates Roman peace. Of course, temple desecration was against the law with respect to Rome, but certainly a violation of Jewish sensitivities as well. And so the Sanhedrin are going to present their case against Paul as someone inciting riot and desecrating the temple in Jerusalem. So, as I mentioned earlier, Roman citizens, are given the opportunity to respond to any charge. Had Paul been merely a slave or a Jew who was not a citizen, he might have been given a summary judgment, and whatever it was, that's what would happen. But as a citizen, he has certain rights. So, Paul is going to urge this charge is without proof. You can't just make an accusation, say it happened. You have to prove that it happened. And he says, none of these things happened. I did not desecrate the temple. I have not been causing riots all over the world. I am, however, a follower of Jesus Christ. But I am a believer in the Torah and the prophets, and I believe in the resurrection of the dead and a final resurrection, which would be true of all Pharisees. Now, Paul is going to be in Caesarea for some time in prison. In fact, all the way to the change of office. Felix is going to be called by Caesar Nero in AD 58 or 59. So this is partly why we think that Paul's arrest in Jerusalem was right about this time. He now appears before the new incoming governor, who is a man by the name of Festus. So when Festus comes into office, he's coming into office with this tricky situation in which he has a Roman citizen who's been charged by a bunch of Jews who are not citizens, but they are powerful because they are members of the Sanhedrin. And now he's got to figure out what is he going to do with this situation. So he entertains at least the possibility of moving the trial back to Jerusalem. Wow, Paul does not want that to happen. He knows that they are going to try to assassinate him if he goes back to Jerusalem. And to get a fair trial in Jerusalem would be next to impossible. So at this point, Paul is going to make his direct appeal to Caesar, which is his right as a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar. Well, stating it bluntly as he has stated it, there's nothing that the government official can do except honor this request. Paul is a Roman citizen. So Porcius Festus, the new governor, is going to have to abandon his plan to move Paul back to Jerusalem, because Paul is absolutely not going to do that. He's going to appeal to Caesar. So when that option is now off of the table, the case just kind of lingers there, much as it had before. And in the end, Paul is going to end up spending no less than 2 years in Caesarea in imprisonment. Now, this raises another kind of question, and it has to do with Paul's letters. Paul wrote 4 letters while he was in chains. It has been sort of the default position that he wrote those letters when he was in chains in Rome, so later than this period. However, in none of those letters does he say where he is when he wrote them. And some of the letters seem to be reflecting different situations than in other letters. For instance, the kind of people he mentions in one letter he doesn't mention in another letter, and so on. So some scholars have speculated that perhaps some of Paul's prison letters may have been written from Caesarea. We simply don't know the answer to this. In any case, Festus directly asked Paul, if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem. Paul is going to claim his right to appeal to Caesar. I don't want to go to Jerusalem. I will take my chances with Caesar Nero rather than take my chances with the Jews in Jerusalem. Now, there's going to be one other speech that Paul's going to make, this time to Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa is the second, and this would be separated from Agrippa I, whom we met earlier in the book. Herod Agrippa II is the provincial king of Caesarea Philippi, Now, this would be the area that is north and slightly east of Galilee. He has come to pay his respects to the new incoming governor. The new incoming governor has arrived, and it's traditional to to do the political niceties. And so Paul is brought before Agrippa as well. He's heard about this case. The new governor has told him about this tricky situation, and Herod Agrippa is familiar with Jewish issues. And so he says, I kind of like to see this guy. So once more, Paul is going to speak to Agrippa and rehearse his early life as a Pharisee, his persecution of Christians, how he was converted on the Damascus Road, and finally his call by God to an international mission to Gentiles. Now, this will be the third time in the book of Acts that there is the story of Paul's conversion. You have the original story in Acts chapter 9. Then you have a recounting of that in Acts chapter 22. And now you have a third recounting of that in Acts chapter 26. It's interesting as you compare those three accounts that in each of them there are slight details that are given which are not always in the other stories. The basic storyline is the same, but you do get a fuller picture as you listen to all three of these recountings. So Festus was pleased to discuss Paul's case with Agrippa. The charges were religious issues, and Agrippa is very familiar with Jewish issues, so he probably is hoping maybe Festus can give me some good advice. I don't know. So Paul rehearses again his basic defense that he is on trial because he believes in the resurrection of the dead based on the Torah. He believes in the prophets, but in particular, he believes in the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Well, the dignitaries themselves, once they hear Paul's fifth defense, they all agreed that if Paul had not appealed to Caesar, they might have actually been able to set him free. But the appeal to Caesar is not something you can retract. So since Paul has appealed to Caesar, then to Caesar he is going to go. So now we come to the end of the book of Acts, the last couple of chapters, which are going to describe Paul's voyage to Rome, his arrival in the city, and his 2 years incarceration there. So after the 2 years at Caesarea, Festus extradites Paul to Rome under armed guard. Paul and a number of other prisoners are assigned to a Roman centurion by the name of Julius. They're going to board a coastal vessel that's headed basically to the north and the west, going to the shore of Mysia. And it's interesting that the first person plural pronouns appear here as well. So Luke is going to say, use the we word, we traveled, we went, and so on. So apparently Luke is allowed to accompany Paul on this voyage. They're battling prevailing winds because they're now really at the end of the shipping season when most people are going to basically not do anything for a couple of months or so. They change ships from the coaster, probably get on a grain vessel that is headed more in the direction they want to go toward Rome. And in fact, Paul is going to warn them against going forward because we're really out of the period of time when it is safe to travel. But the centurion and, in fact, the pilot of the vessel are determined to reach a better winter harbor. Paul had recommended that they wintered at Fair Havens. So probably they are in about the period of time of sometime in either like late October or early November, something like that. If they would winter, they would spend November, December, maybe January in some place before they try to get back to the waterways headed toward Rome. So this is the island of Crete, and this is the bay of Fair Havens, which you can see in this picture. This is this bay right in here. So this is where Paul is hoping that they would winter. But in fact, the pilot and the centurion are determined to go on. So this is the basic route. They're going to start obviously in Jerusalem. Paul is going to go by cavalry escort up to Caesarea, 2 years imprisoned in Caesarea. Then they're going to work their way northward, hitting a number of places in this coaster vessel. They'll eventually change ships. This is where Paul is hoping that they will winter in the island of Crete. Of course, they don't do that. So you follow the jagged line going this way, in which they're going to be very turbulent weather and eventually are going to be shipwrecked on the island of Malta. They are going to have to spend the winter there. And after the winter, then they will head their way northward, eventually making it to Italy and on continuing to Rome. Well, the seas are very turbulent. The crew has pitched the cargo overboard or some of the tackle. They've pretty much given up on survival. They probably figure they're going to drown. But Paul stands up, and even as a prisoner, he's still a leader. It's one of the amazing things about Paul is that even when he is in captivity, he still is the leading voice. He says, "I was visited by an angel, and we're all going to make it. The ship's going to run aground, but if you stay with the ship, you will be saved." So for 14 days, the ship is driven relentlessly toward the west. It's dark, it's rainy, the wind is whipping. They're in storms. They have no idea quite where they are. Eventually, they start taking soundings with cables or ropes, and that seemed to indicate that they were near some kind of shore. Paul says, well, you better eat, keep your strength up, but if you stay with the ship, you will make it. The ship finally does run aground. It begins to break apart, and everybody is now either swimming or clinging to flotsam from the pieces of the ship, and all 276 are going to make it safely to shore. And, of course, that will include Paul himself. So they all survived the shipwreck. Paul and the others discovered they're actually on the island of Malta, which is south of Italy. They're going to be 3 months there before they can put out to sea again. So probably the months of November, December, January, something like that. So they're going to wait for the new shipping season for the weather to become more feasible. And during their stay there, Paul has an interesting miracle in which a viper bite, which normally would be fatal, and he just kind of nonchalantly shook it off in the fire, and nothing happened. And some people started thinking, "Wow, maybe he's a god, maybe he's a divine figure of some kind." While he's at Malta, Paul is going to be involved in another healing, the healing of the father of the chief official, at the government center there. And then finally they're able to travel again. So they put in at Syracuse, Sicily. They reach the what we often call the boot toe of Italy because of its shape at Rhegium. Finally up the coast of the land at Puteoli, and finally at the northern end of the Gulf of Naples. And then the rest of the trip is going to be done overland as they head toward their last leg of the trip to Rome. Incidentally, this is an ancient relief of a Roman commercial vessel from the time that we're talking about. So you can get kind of a visual of what an ocean vessel might have looked like. Now, in this particular figure, the people in the boat are quite oversized from what they would normally be in this ship. This ship looks, at least given the size of the figures, like it's about the size of a rowboat. Actually, it was much larger than a rowboat, especially if it had 276 people in it. This was a large ship. But oftentimes, depictions in the ancient world have perspective issues, at least from the way we would think about it in the modern world. It is interesting that this ship does have a figurehead. So if you look at my cursor right over on the very far right, you can see the visual face of the figurehead of the ship, which is a female of some kind. I'm not sure who it depicts. In the ship that Paul was in, they also had a figurehead. In fact, two figureheads, the twin gods Castor and Pollux. And those are actually mentioned by Luke as the figurehead of the ship in which Paul was traveling to Rome. Once they get on the land part of the journey, they're going to go up the Via Appia, which is the major road coming from the south leading to Rome. And like a number of Roman roads that we have mentioned before, there are portions of the Via Appia that are still there. And in fact, still in use after 2 millennia. You can see this one has some fairly heavy ruts in it. which are worn into these solid stone pavings, probably by centuries of wagons and chariots and those sorts of things. This stone pavement actually dates to about 3 centuries before the time of Paul. So this is a very, very old piece of roadway, and this is the one over which Paul traveled as he comes to Rome. Finally reaching Rome, Paul is put under house arrest to await his hearing before Caesar Nero. Now that's really a privilege to be under house arrest rather than being in the dungeon in Rome, and no doubt this was due to the fact that he is a Roman citizen. He wouldn't have been allowed to attend the local synagogue, so he's under house arrest. He has to stay in the house. But he does request an audience with some of the synagogue members, and they come to see him where he was incarcerated in the house. And he shares with them his vision of the message of Jesus to the nations. Some of them actually are going to accept what he says, and others are going to turn away. This is pretty much the typical response he's been getting from synagogue members throughout the world. Some are going to believe that he's proved his point from the Old Testament prophecies, and others are going to decline. But in any case, we come at last to the final verse in the book of Acts. Now, I've given it to you in Greek here, and you may not be Greek readers, but I want to go through it in Greek because I think Luke is doing something in a literary way with this final verse that's important. Here's the way it reads in Greek. Start with a participle karuson, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching the things. The article ta just means the, and we would add the word things, concerning the Lord Jesus Christ. And then it's the preposition with, and then passos, which means all of the things, with all boldness, parasios. And then this last word is akalutos, which is the word unhindered. Now, I think it is important in a literary way to note that the very last word in the Greek text of the book of Acts is the word unhindered. The reason I'm making a point of this is that in almost none of the English translations do they translate this with unhindered being the last word. It makes for a little bit of awkward English, admittedly, but I think what Luke is doing is saying that the whole point of this long history that has gone all the way from the day of Pentecost now ends up in Rome, and the gospel is unhindered. The original paradigm for the gospel was that, as Jesus said just before he ascended back to the Father, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth, the whole nations of the earth. That has now happened. Paul has reached the very center, at least culturally speaking and politically speaking, the very center of the Roman Empire. And this would be the final part of his story. So the gospel that began in Jerusalem did go to Judea. It did go to Samaria. And now in the travels of Paul throughout the Roman world and eventually him ending up in Rome, the gospel has reached Rome, and it is now being able to be preached unhindered. The very last word in the book of Acts. Well, Paul is going to end up being in Rome for a couple of years, and Luke doesn't tell us how this all turns out. In fact, this is going to be one of the great puzzles we have about the closing years of Paul's life, is because we don't exactly know what happened. In the 5th century, there is an ancient tradition that Paul was released by Nero and went to do mission work in Spain. We do know from his letter to the Romans that he wanted to go to Spain. In fact, part of the reason he wrote the Roman letter was so that they would help him on his way, and he wanted to go to Spain. Then in this tradition, Paul was said to have been arrested a second time, also before Caesar Nero, and this time he would be executed by beheading. Now, beheading is, in fact, a privilege of a Roman citizen. You may say, wow, that's not much of a privilege to me. But if the alternative was crucifixion, Beheading is at least quick, and crucifixion is an extended, slow death by agonizing suffering. So the tradition that Paul was beheaded is supported in the ancient world, but there are competing traditions, and in fact, a bit earlier traditions that make it sound like Paul was not released by Caesar, but in fact was executed. So we don't really know whether Paul was executed at the end of the 2 years that Luke talks about in the book of Acts, or whether he was released, did some more mission work, came back, and later was arrested and executed later. These are some of the unknowns, and they remain unknown about the life of Paul. I suppose it's probably fair to say that the majority of scholars favor the idea that Paul was executed after this imprisonment in the book of Acts and did not go to Spain. But again, as I say, there are competing traditions and we simply don't know. So that brings us to the end of the book of Acts and the two great apostles that this book talks about. The first half, the apostle Peter; the second half, the apostle Paul. And erected above the traditional site of where Paul was eventually buried at the Church of St. Paul outside the walls in the city of Rome is this ancient inscription. And even though it is in Latin letters, you should be able to read it. Paula, Apostle Martyr. Paul, the apostle and the martyr. And that is, in a word, the summary of Paul's ministry and life. So I hope these lectures have been helpful to you, and may the Lord bless you as you serve him in your work and ministry.